Hey everyone, I'm going to try something new today. I'm going to be diving in real time here live with some of the things that I'm currently interested in my private life. I'm going through with my community in the Ground and Glory Guild 2023 Personal Empowerment or Personal Finance Empowerment Challenge. So I've given them the task of reading a book on finance every month throughout the year and really powering up on personal finance and macroeconomics. Of course, I'm deciding to do this myself, and I have taken such a great interest over this last month or two into how the big players in the financial markets, and especially the central banks, how they have really undermined what we think of as democracy in a such an insidious way over at least 100 years. And I think more and more of us now are starting to question if we actually have a functioning democracy any longer. Over the last several years, we have noticed, at least if we have paid attention outside of the mainstream media box, we have noticed how our governments are really starting to violate our constitutions and the laws of our respective countries, that they're passing laws in kind of secret ways, giving us maybe a couple of days or a week at best to review it and give feedback as citizens, when it actually comes down to really, really severe attacks on our civil liberties. Many don't even know that this is going on, but it is. It absolutely is. And why? And why doesn't it seem to matter if there's a government from the left or on the right sitting in the seat of power? Like, the same policies are pushed regardless of whether it's the right or the left is in power. And so something is clearly happening behind the scenes that is aligning the political fronts along a bigger goal that is pushing our society in a particular direction. And what it comes down to is actually monetary policy. And there are many more conspiratorial lenses that we can take, but we're just going to stay with very, very clear facts today. Facts that are documented by Nomi Prins in her book Collusion: How Central Bankers Rigged the World. I'm not going to add any production today. We're just going to review it. I'm going to take you through it because I love this book. It absolutely blew my mind. And while I was on it in the past, I now really see very clearly what is going on. So without question, you should read her book, Nomi Prins, Collusion. She used to be, I think, a general manager. Was it in Goldman Sachs? I think it was in Goldman Sachs. So she's been really on the inside of the system. So let's review. Back in 1907 in the US, there was a financial panic because the national banking system that was constructed in a hierarchical way, but in also a decentralized way, with minor banks and towns and the cities and bigger banks. And then the biggest National Reserve Bank was in New York. That whole system, including a lot of trusts, which was a big thing back then, it started to buckle because, well, they didn't have liquidity in the system to serve all of the customers that wanted to get the money out. And so there was a bank run and people freaked out. But a team of legendary bankers that you've probably heard of, headed by JP Morgan, I think John D. Rockefeller was also involved in this. They intervened and they wanted to stabilize this chaos, and they gathered on Jekyll Island in Georgia, and then they sketched out the plans for a way to centralize the banking system because they felt that the decentralized banking system is what created the problem. So if everything was centralized, things were going to be better. And I think it was back in the 1700s that the first central bank came into being. It was actually in the country where I currently live, Sweden, Sveriges Riksbank. And the funny thing about central banks is that their main charter is to support governments in stabilizing the economy. And so we have come to see them as friends in some way, that they're helping us. But generally speaking, central banks are actually run as private for-profit businesses. So there are financial corporations that are owned privately for the most part, and they're in it to win it. They're in it to make money. And the interesting thing is that even though they are essentially businesses, privately run, they have certain rights that no other business have. And it's the right to print money, to create money from scratch. So it's a very unique business model that these central banks have. They are given full privilege to engage in an activity that for any other business would be considered criminal, and that is indeed to create money from scratch. So there was no precedence for this in the US until Woodrow Wilson passed the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. And the former Republican president before him had also paved the way. So as Republican, Democrats both involved in getting the Federal Reserve into place, right? So here we have the Federal Reserve, and their main charter is to stabilize the economy, ensure that interest rates and inflation are stable, and that the employment of the US is good. And it turns out, of course, we know this, that they didn't succeed in fulfilling their mandate, because in 1929 to 1939 we had the Great Depression, and we now have a lot of people that are, yeah, hey John, yeah, I'm here. Just comment and ask questions if you have anything. This is important for us now that we are in these very, very rocky financial waters. There's a lot. Well, I think we all know at this point that we're heading into very rough waters, and we may cover some of this by the end of it. But Great Depression, 1929, we have a deflationary economy. So basically, things get cheaper and the money becomes more worth. And we think traditionally it's like, I would have thought that, that's a good thing, right? That the money becomes more worth. But actually, no, this created the Great Depression. And the reason for this is that our financial markets work in a very strange way. So if we have high interest rates, shall we say, then people actually, they don't want to hoard their money. Or they do. Sorry, if the interest rates are high, then I don't want to spend a lot, because I can get like 10% interest rate in the bank, if times are good in terms of interest rates. But of course, if you're somebody who wants to spend, like you want to buy a house, for instance, then interest rate isn't a good thing, high interest rate. And so what happens with the deflationary economy is that the economy grinds to a halt and people don't want to buy things anymore. So there is no excess purchasing. We don't want that. And if you're a financier, a banker, an investor, this is like your worst nightmare, because there's nowhere where you can make money, because there is no money moving through the markets because of the deflationary economy. And so we have the sitting government. It was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Democrat. He's on it, and New Deal and all that stuff. Now they're dealing with the Green New Deal, as if the first New Deal was like a fantastic thing. But he wants to fix this problem, and of course, the Fed had certain limitations in their ability to deal with the financial upset because of the gold standard. Okay, the gold standard meant that for each dollar in existence, there needed to be 40 cents worth of gold in whatever, the treasury in Fort Knox or wherever. And that meant that in order to put more liquidity into the markets, there needed to be more gold. And actually, US had most of the gold already. And so they did something really extreme. They passed an executive order, 6,000, I don't remember the number exactly, 104, 107, something like that. And it was an executive order to confiscate the gold of the people. So if you own gold, bucko, then give it to us because we have a depression to solve. And interestingly, only about 25% of the American people agreed to this, and good for them, because what happened was that after the Fed got about 2,500 tons worth of gold, I believe, they changed the peg of the gold because they needed more money in the market. And it had been, I think, $20, 67 cents. But by changing the peg of the gold, that is the preset valuation of an ounce of gold, by changing that, all of a sudden, they can print more money, right? And so overnight, they just say now an ounce of gold is worth $35 instead. And so everyone who had followed the orders from the government, they lost 40% of their money just overnight. The 75% of the Americans who didn't follow it, they they stayed, they saved, or it worked out for them. But of course, the risk was that if they didn't do it, they were going to be fined like $10,000 back then. It's like more than $200,000 today, and they might end up in prison for like 10 years. Very extreme, very extreme. So before we move on, why am I telling you this? It's because history rhymes, and we have certain trends in the economy right now that is challenging our sovereignty. And because I care a lot about working with men and their sovereignty, we need to understand what is going on inside of the financial markets. And I've always been very interested in the macroeconomy, and I do believe that we can navigate as sovereign beings in this world better if we understand the players that are pulling the strings behind the scenes, so to speak. So here we are, 1933, and we have to give the money to the government, and the government starts creating a lot of new money in order to add liquidity to the market so that inflation can increase and the economy can restart. Didn't work. So they took the gold and they did something that didn't work. But then, luckily for America, maybe, the Second World War broke out and put the economy into wartime economy, and there's all kinds of production. So that saved the economy. I don't know enough about that to say that it saved the economy, but certainly it changed the orientation of the people of America from being internally in conflict to having a shared common enemy. So 1930, the Second World War breaks out, 1939, and in 1944 we see that the Allied forces are close to winning. We have the Bretton Woods Conference, and I think 44 nations, allies, gather in, I think, New Hampshire, and they start talking about the steps that the world are going to take after the war to rebuild and to create a new roadmap for the future. And what they do is that they start shifting the gold standard. So the various countries around the world that have less gold, they agree that the US dollar is going to be the world reserve currency at this point, and that a dollar will be pegged to 35, or an ounce of gold will be pegged to $35. Okay? So then we have we have Fort Knox full of gold, and the US really is the boss of the world. Everyone cares about the dollar. All central banks around the world has the dollar and know that it can be exchanged for gold if they needed to. And that seems to work fine until it no longer does in 1971. Uh, the US finds that they want to spend a lot of money, and also some of the Bretton Woods partners, they want access to some of the gold. And so all of a sudden, the gold isn't anymore sufficient. And basically, the system is bankrupt. It doesn't. It's gone. It's not working anymore. But instead of, you can imagine, instead of reimagining the system more conservatively and to change monetary policies, uh, it's liberalized, which always happens. We'll find when you look at the last 100 years, every war, every financial crisis has led to an increased liberalization of monetary policies, which means that money has become less and less connected to the material world, and more like energy, like magic, right? And that's in 1971, money is completely severed from the material world. And this opens the door, of course, to unprecedented games, monetarily speaking. And I think this is when things start getting really interesting, because I think it is clear that money um, is energy, and it's connected to how we be with energy. It is connected to how we channel our energy, how we focus, uh, and it's a very strange thing, money. It's like tangible and intangible at the same time, and it certainly became really intangible in 1971. And the interesting thing was, because inflation, of course, is supposed to be about 2% per year. That's ideal in the world of bankers, financiers. Like, the whole fiat currency model is based on 2% inflation per year being ideal, which means that our money devalues increasingly, right? So, for instance, over the last 100 years, I think a dollar has devalued by around 30x or something like that. So, a dollar at the beginning of the 1900s was worth like 30 times more than it is worth today. And we have come to think that that's normal, that things just get more expensive. But actually, it's not normal. It's indicative of the system that we're in, a fiat currency, debt-based currency, or an economy where you create new money through fractional reserve banking, which means that the banks can have just a little bit of the money that you deposit into them, and then they can sort of multiply it by 10, and then they can lend that money out to other people. So it's a debt-based economy, and so money magic creates more money all of the time, which creates inflation in the market, right? But it's not supposed to be too high, because then it creates all kinds of problems. But this is why our money starts getting worth less and less for every passing year, right? Um, the Second World War was also interesting, because women moved into the factories, and we saw this as some sort of victory for women. You can do it. Like, you have this sort of feminist posters. So you paint World War II out to be some sort of victory for feminine empowerment. But if you actually go under the surface, you may want to rethink that a bit, because what is actually going on? First of all, of course, is a very strong propaganda campaign suggesting that it's a victory for women to work. So women flock to the factories, and of course they stay in the factories after the Second World War, even though maybe not to the same degree, but you've opened the doors. Why? Because of inflation. Because if women had not been convinced that it was empowering for them to work, then inflation would have made it so that a household with just one adult working would not have been tenable any longer. maybe by the 50s or probably more like the 60s, or even 70s. I'm not super clear on these numbers, but it would no longer be tenable for a household to have just the man working, shall we say. And so then it was wonderful that you have had feminism telling women that it's amazing to be able to work and make your own money. And yes, it's empowering on the one hand, but on the other hand, this happened because of the financial system needing women in order to not collapse. So this is where you have to understand that feminism has convinced women that they need to work in order for the monetary policies or the financial system that we have to stay intact. Without women working, it would have all crashed in the 70s, probably. So you choose if women found their empowerment or if they became slaves of the financial system, just like men were. It's up to you to to make your choice on that one. But back to 1971, we have a liberalization of the monetary policies. There is no gold standard anymore. Money magic is fully engaged. So now you can do all kinds of things with money that you couldn't previously. And the ball keeps rolling, right? Because money is now just an idea and it has nothing to do with gold anymore. And so the gold, I guess, isn't so important for the US anymore. And by now we know that the US doesn't even hold that much gold anymore. Like China and Russia have bought a lot, and I think hold more. I'm not entirely sure on those numbers. So then we have a few decades with booms and busts. We have all kinds of financial problems throughout the 70s and 80s, and I guess even 90s. But let's move to the 2000s. We have the dot-com and boom and bust. The bubble breaks, and we're sobered yet again. We thought it was going to be amazing for like ever. This time is going to be different. you know and that breaks apart, and again, investors, speculators, they are in the hunt for a new investment products. And this is when it starts getting interesting, because the central banks have sort of been lurking in the background this whole time, been pulling the strings. And even the gold heist, as it's called, back in 1933, was a precursor for what was going to come in the 2000s. The investors, they find that there are certain financial products in the US that seem very promising, because securities from the government, bonds from corporations, and governments, they weren't yielding enough, and investors, they always want the biggest return on investment. And so they're always on the hunt for opportunities. So there's very greed driven business. And so they find mortgage-backed securities in the US. And these securities that are essentially like big clusters of mortgages that you can buy a share of this security instead of being in direct relationship with the house owner. And so then you become kind of like an owner of those mortgages in a way. And these securities had a great yield in the 2008, 7, 8. Well, prior to that as well, but the problems really started coming 2007. And why did this happen? It was because the money lenders. There's the money lenders. Do you remember the money lenders from the Bible that Jesus Christ comes and says, out of the temple? The money lenders, they are greedy. Of course they are. Just like the investors. So they want to provide as many mortgages for these mortgage-backed securities as at all possible. At all possible. Because there's a bubble building again. Let's build the bubble. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be different this time. And so because they're like blinded and completely high on money, they throw the ethics out of the window, right? That's typically what happens when people get greedy, and potentially that is about to happen again if we are indeed entering a bull market. But what happens then is that the money lenders, they completely relax the requirements for having a mortgage. Oh, we're so generous. You don't need to have any money to buy this beautiful house, because we're going to create this adjustable rate mortgage, and you don't need to pay anything. Like for the first several years, interest, no down payments at least, and very little interest, and it's going to be so easy. And so you have a lot of low income families that buy really nice houses, and they think like, oh wow, this was a great deal. I have this beautiful house. I can't believe that we're being given these opportunities by these generous people. And then, of course, because they're financially uninformed, they don't realize that they're in a trap. They're in an adjustable rate mortgage trap, where the payments are about to balloon, and that's what happens. And soon enough, people start defaulting on their mortgages. The money lenders, they didn't even conceive of this being possible, because they're hungry and greedy for money, and all they can imagine is that house prices are just going to keep on increasing. And worst case, all of these customers that don't have so much money, they can just sell their home and earn a nice, what's the name in English? Well, make a good deal that way, right? But of course, this is not what happens because of the adjustable rate mortgages. This is not what happens. So people start defaulting on their loans as the mortgage rates start ballooning, and the bubble bursts, and Lehman Brothers collapses, Bear Stearns collapses, dozens of banks around the world collapse, because they've all been heavily invested in these absolutely toxic securities, like toxic mortgages. I think $14 trillion just evaporate from the markets over a couple of years. Now it's time for the central banks to rise. Their opportunity is finally here. And the central banks, make no mistake, they supported, or at least the Fed under Bernanke's leadership, supported these mortgage-backed securities. And now the whole system crashes, and Bernanke, he blames all kinds of other emerging markets and everyone but himself, and he's now going to become the hero. And you will find, if you go online, and this makes my blood boil just a little bit, he's being celebrated as a hero, the guy who saved the economy. The gold standard is no longer. Money magic is completely possible. We can just open a dimensional hole to another dimension where people breathe money, and it just starts streaming out. And how do you do this? You do quantitative easing. So remember the gold heist, where they confiscated the gold in order to then up level the peg, and then start printing more money. Like, it's the same principle in a way, but the way it works is because central banks are the only business model in the world that has the privilege and even the charter, I would say, to print money in order to stabilize the markets. That's what they do. And they take this printed money and they buy bonds, government bonds, corporate bonds, securities of all kinds. And then that money sort of floods into the markets in order to stimulate the economy. And then you take that money to save. You help stabilize the banks that are about to crash. You help big banks buy smaller banks that are about to collapse, and so on and so forth. I believe that quantitative easing was as a concept was invented in Japan by the Bank of Japan a few years prior. I don't quite remember the details on that. Again, all of that is in Nomi Prins's book. But the point being here is that Bernanke starts creating money out of thin air. And then first the Bush government and then the Obama government, of course, are going to save the day, as the generous souls that they are. And they start to pass stimulus packages. I think over those years to the order of around $1.5 trillion, based entirely on conjured money. The important red pill here, this is why I'm doing this, so you get to understand. Maybe you understand, but I just fully grokked how this works, so that's why I want to share it with you. Is that this money was supposed to stimulate the economy, but central banks across the world, especially the G3 the G3 central banks, that would be the Eurozone, like the EU and Japan, and then United States, they didn't require that this money actually ended up on Main Street. And so it didn't. It all was either hoarded by the banks, or the banks used it to buy themselves back. So billions of dollars was used, actually trillions of dollars, was used by banks to buy back their own stocks. And by buying back themselves, they inflated the markets. And so the markets just explode. And so you have this feeling that like there's so much money in the system and everything is like, whoa. And if you are in the markets and you understand how to trade, that's true. But most people don't understand how to trade. There are winners and losers in the markets, and most of the winners are big corporations that have access to supercomputers that analyze and trade like that. And the more that AI actually runs the markets, the harder it is for retail investors to make money there. The money doesn't go to Main Street. And because it doesn't go to Main Street, it doesn't actually impact inflation in the same way. And because the crisis is moving the economy into more of a deflationary place, the central banks think that all of this quantitative easing, the conjured money, is going to fix the problem. But they don't tell the banks and the various financial institutions, corporations that they're sponsoring, they don't tell them that, okay, you need to help Main Street with this, give them really excellent loans, so on and so forth. Which creates this vicious loop where the central banks keep printing money in order to increase inflation and to fix the economy. But that money doesn't go to Main Street, and then so inflation isn't increased. And so they need to print more money to increase inflation, which then again isn't used to increase inflation to 2%. And that cycle was just like run for years and years and years. Of course, inflation was always going to happen in the end. But utilizing this as an excuse, the central banks across the world printed $21 trillion. And hardly any of it ended up on Main Street. And so the central banks created this just insane world of speculation. And while, for instance, Bernanke, he was blaming emerging economies for these problems, the speculators who now were swimming in billions of conjured money, what did they do? They were, as investors always do, they were looking for a return on investment. And so they found emerging markets that had a higher interest rate than the US because they were more deflationary. And just like pouring money into these markets, completely destabilizing the economy. People don't know what to do. There's like a boom, and all of a sudden, these people find a new country that has better interest rate, and then they just take all of the money out of the market, leaving the emerging economy completely in tatters, and then they go to another one. And so the Western countries, the G3 countries, G7, using conjured money, completely ravaged the emerging markets. Absolute, complete warfare. Even though, of course, it's not considered as such, but in reality, investors using fake money to completely vampirically suck money out of emerging markets, and then, donating a few millions through various NGOs that's going to prevent hunger and, that kind of thing. You just extract a couple of trillion or at least 100 billion from a country, and then people are like suffering like hell. And so you send back like $1 million of welfare, right? 1 billion. And then you feel good about it. It's like most of that welfare, of course, comes out of your pockets as taxes or as private donations. And you don't even need to know that the reason that these countries are completely screwed is because of our monetary policies that is just like ruining them every time. And here's the thing, if you hear about like a dictator or a tyrant in some kind of a country, if you look deeper, a lot of the time you will find that this person isn't in agreement with the Fed's monetary policy. And so then the media tells us that this person is terrible so that we can support warfare against them. But the issue actually was that country, be it Iraq or Libya or whatever other country, they were actively opposed to Western imperial monetary policy. And so they had to be taken out. So the wars are always about Western monetary policy. And then the propaganda of the media is to give us the impression that we live in this beautiful democracy that is exporting democracy to all of these countries with tyrants in them. But actually what's happening is that we, by being uninformed, are giving credibility to the financial war that the Fed with the various Western allies is waging against any country out there that wants to have a genuine democracy that is independent of Western monetary policies. This is scary when you really understand how the world works. This is like a fucking red pill right here. Pardon my French. And so then the people, when you watch the news, that are being celebrated as heroes of democracy after the West has successfully exported democracy, who are they? They are the puppet regimes that are following the orders from the West of bringing neoliberal monetary policies into the country, because then, using financial warfare, the country can be controlled and bought. This all started happening full force because of the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. We thought Bernanke saved the economy, but actually he helped and inspired a financial paradigm based entirely on money conjuring that gave $21 trillion to Wall Street or whatever other banking institutions around the world so that they could buy the world. If you wonder why Vanguard and BlackRock own so much, I don't exactly know how the systems here work. But it wouldn't be far-fetched to think that a lot of these stimulus packages, of course, a lot of this money doesn't end up on Main Street. We know this. Trillions of dollars just disappear. I mean, this was shared the day before, coincidence or not, the day before 9/11. Donald Rumsfeld stands on the podium and says, whoopsie, we lost $2 trillion. This money goes somewhere. It goes somewhere where people that want to buy the world operate, I think. Regardless, a completely new paradigm had been instantiated. And even though, you know, you watch politics and you watch the culture wars and you think that we have a democracy because, you know, there's this heated exchange of ideas between, shall we say, the left and the right. Ultimately, it's the same monetary policies that are pushed by both. Like it was Bush and Obama, and then the COVID era comes, and Trump passes a 3.8 trillion stimulus package in his presidency, and then Biden comes, and after he is it inaugurated? It is called, I think so. He passes a $1.9 trillion, and so throughout the COVID era, I think it's like a full $6 trillion that are just completely made out of nowhere to stimulate an economy that was broken by the kinds of restrictions that we added to it that we now know were unnecessary and inefficient. The John Hopkins study on the efficiency of lockdowns is very clear on this. The lockdowns didn't work. So then again, we needed to create $5 or $6 trillion out of nowhere because of idiotic policies. And then we have this impression that they are saving the economy, but where does that money go? Not to Main Street. Oh, some went to Main Street over the COVID era. There were some handouts, shall we say. But what you need to see now is that we're living in a debt-based monetary system where so much money is being made every year. For instance, the US runs a $1.5 trillion annual deficit, which is being serviced by credit from the central bank and maybe other countries. And what happens, like this spun me out when I started to realize how it actually works, is that when a government runs a deficit, I don't think all central banks have this in their charter that they can create money out of nowhere, but certainly the G3 central banks have it. Like Mario Draghi, for instance, when he was a central banker, head of the Central Bank of Europe, he just churned it out, even though he never succeeded. So these central bankers have such authority and like we're going to save the economy, but then they proceed to not succeed. They don't help, at least not Main Street. They save the markets, but it's not the actual economy. So it's just mind-blowing to understand that a government runs a deficit, which means that money needs to come either from loans from other sovereign countries or from money the central bank creates, as it is in their charter and business model to do so. Those central banks are privately owned. They're for-profit organizations. If politicians object to these monetary policies, they get punished, they get taken out, they get replaced. So if you, as a politician, have some sort of idealized notion that you're going to create a more equitable world, there's going to be more democracy, then the moment you get put into power through hopefully a fair election, you get sabotaged by the system that wants puppets to the monetary policy. This is how it works. This is why, regardless of whether you're left or right, you get the same result, because the people who want true democracy are removed. They are removed because central bankers every year own the world a little bit more with money that they themselves create. Central bankers and their corporate allies that receive their money. And so this is the business model. Put incompetent puppet politicians in places of government, have them start wrecking the economy. When the economy gets wrecked, send in the central bankers, use the media to champion them as saviors of the economy, have them print money that goes to Wall Street, to financial corporations, and have those corporations gradually buy the assets that were previously on Main Street, create a massive wealth transfer from Main Street to Wall Street, while making Main Street believe that they're being helped and saved and rescued. Have Main Street argue between each other over culture war issues. Have them think that they are on the right side of history because they're on the left or on the right. Have them be completely ignorant of what is actually happening behind or backstage. This is the business model. Gradually sell away the national assets and Main Street's assets through central bank and their allies, through generating crisis after crisis after crisis, using monetary policy war. This is why Western democracy doesn't exist any longer. It is an illusion, fully propagated by the media and fully propagated by the culture war combat, so that you think you can get distracted into thinking that if you have the right opinion on abortion or taxes or gun laws, then you're like doing your part, completely ignorant of what's happening in the financial systems. So this is just, I just wanted to bring this out there, and I would love for you to join me in my substack. Everything that I shared with you now is a part of my new substack. I'm going to write about things that maybe isn't so popular that I write about, at least from some people. But truth is my path, man. It is my method. It is all that I care about. So I just want to see if I can. I think I may get this crazy Hall of Mirrors effect for a moment here now. Let's see. No. Here. So I'm gonna start writing about topics that relate to your sovereignty and to our ability to actually live in a world that works. I think we're generally waking up to the fact that we don't live in functional democracies anymore, and that regardless of who gets elected, we see the same problems just increase, and it is because of what I've just shared with you guys. And yeah, join me here. Let's see if I can. For some reason, this thing does not show the URL. Let's see if it can. Oh yeah, it's just sharing a tab. I'm gonna see if we can start sharing the whole screen, because I would love for you to join me there. Window, yeah, here we go. There. Now you get the URL as well. Is ivanfshellum.substack.com. It's very new, my Substack, but I'm going to spend time on writing on this. This is, my main focus is supporting men in really rising, touching ground, claiming glory, which I like to say now, which is to say that you need to humble yourself and you need to really get embodied and fully connected to yourself before you claim your glory, and to live in that paradox and also that cycle of life. I just want you as a man to thrive, to rock it out there, and I know that a lot of you are struggling, and this Substack will be in service of bringing attention to issues that I won't be able to bring attention to in other media. So, but maybe if you enjoy this this form of me presenting, then I may do it more. I would love for you to share whatever you have to you reflect back to me, or what you got out of this. This actually ended up being 50 minutes. I had no fucking clue that it was going to be that long, but well, it did become long. So it's good to be here with you. Love to hear from you, and I hope this was helpful. If you're just watching this at the end now, you just know that I just covered everything over the last 100 years over how the central banks have basically destroyed our democracy and how we lived in a completely messed up system now, and it's time to wake up to it. So have a great day, guys. Pleasure. Bye.